Welcome to the final session of this year's Tokyo Global Dialogue. This session is focusing on the future of international security and cooperation under the theme of Ukraine and the Middle East, the advent of perennial conflict and the future of international security and cooperation. We have 6 excellent panelists with us here and online. We have here with us from right to left, Mr. Carl Bildt, former Prime Minister of Sweden and currently Vice Chairman at Kreab Worldwide. Dr. John Hamre, President and CEO at CSIS. Mr. Justin Bassi, Executive Director at ASPI. It is a great honor to have you three as speakers again. JIIA President Kenichiro Sasae is also joining this session as a speaker. As an online speaker, Ambassador Hemant Krishan, Director General at the Delhi Policy Group and former Ambassador of India to Japan, is joining us. A warm welcome to Ambassador Singh. And last but not least, Ms. Michelle Lee, Tokyo Bureau Chief of the Washington Post, will be the moderator for this session. Ms. Lee, the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I know that you've had a long day of many sessions, much thinking, and we are the final session of the day, so we're going to try to keep this as conversational and fast-moving as possible. I have given a strict time limit for these speakers, and we'll see if they'll be able to keep to them. We'll see. So again, my name is Michelle Ye-Healy. I'm the Tokyo Bureau Chief of the Washington Post. I cover Japan and the Korean Peninsula. I moved to Japan in the middle of COVID in 2021, right after the Tokyo Olympics. So I'm really happy to see it reopen and to welcome so many visitors. I want to thank the Japan Institute of International Affairs and President Sasae for having me. It's a real honor to be on this panel and be able to have a conversation with these very distinguished panelists. So I hope this will be a free-flowing conversation, and we'll just get started. So the past day and a half, there have been lots of topics about the very big questions ahead of us in an increasingly dangerous and less predictable world with many, conflicts ongoing at the same time. Of course, February marks 2 years since Russia's invasion, and we have much instability in many places in the world. So after the past 2 days of the Tokyo Global Dialogue, I'm curious to hear each of your, the one observation that you have taken away, the one thing that you've learned after listening to many of the sessions, participating in many of the sessions. And Ambassador Singh, I know you're attending here remotely, so we'll toss to you to give us some big picture thoughts on this theme to kick us off. Why don't we go this way, and we'll start with Mr. Bildt.
Well, one impression that has been strengthened during the extremely useful discussions today and yesterday is that for all of the talk about Indo-Pacific, this maritime, essentially maritime concept, there is something called a Eurasian strategic environment. And what is happening now is that we see conflicts at one end of that particular Eurasian strategic area, that is Ukraine. And we have to understand that that will, of course, impact what's going to happen at the other end of the European strategic area, be that Korea or be that Taiwan or be that something else. Because you have actors at the center of this Eurasian area. China, Russia, you could discuss how the interaction between them is. But no doubt they're not the same, but no doubt that there's a critically important interaction between them. And what happened at the one end of the strategic theater, that is Eurasia, impacts at the other end of the European strategic theater. I say that with I'm all in favor of all of this Indo-Pacific language, but to me, it the maritime orientation of that discussion sometimes leads us to ignore the Eurasian strategic concept, and I think that is, in the interaction there, interrelationship, is critically important as we look at the future.
Well, for me, what's been most interesting is the anxiety here about what might happen if Donald Trump comes back as president, and the underappreciation for the depth and resilience of the foundational relationship that we have with Japan and throughout Asia. Everybody's so worried about this one guy, you know, but if you just look objectively at the landscape, my goodness, everything is working well. I mean, China is in a major recession, and they're going to be in it for quite a few years, actually. I'm kind of in the peak China camp. I think China is at its apogee of power. I think that I see the economies booming in Asia, and they're being led by Japan, Korea, and India. You know, these are friends. You know, we're knitting together in many different ways a fabric of reassurance in the region. Gosh, I think there's just too much anxiety about one guy and not enough appreciation for the depth of really profound positive dimensions for our future together. So we should be thinking about this in a little different way.
And we'll get into that one guy later. Mr. Bassi.
Thank you. Just to, without copying Carl and John, but sort of leveraging what they said, I think with the world in turmoil and wars and conflict all over the globe, the importance that I've taken away from the conference is the importance of partnerships. Government to government, and we've talked about the importance of whether it be US-Japan or Australia-Japan, Quad, but government to government, government with industry. Governments can no longer do security by themselves, whether it be the space sector, cyberspace. We need industry, and we need governments to facilitate greater work with industry. And we also need industry to work with other parts of industry. So I think partnerships are important. And as Carl said, the importance of working together so that the Indo-Pacific countries are explaining why European countries need to be concerned about what's happening in this region, and why the Indo-Pacific cares about what's happening in Europe. And I think Japan is leading the way in explaining why security in Europe matters to security here. John's always has something interesting to say, that the peak China argument is an excellent argument. I think that part of the issue, regardless of where you see China going, is the focus on ourselves. If we don't compete, if we don't work together, government to government, government with industry, in my view, it won't matter if China has peaked or not, because they'll have the playing field to themselves. So partnerships matter more than anything.
Listening to all this discussion yesterday and today, I was thinking back of the day I was assigned to Washington, year 2012. I think at the time, my difficulty was trying to convince the US government about the nature of Chinese rise and our problem with China, and not necessarily on our Senkaku issues or other maritime issues. We are trying to talk about the fundamental nature of Chinese rise. At the time, I think there was some optimism still, in Washington that Chinese fundamental governance or the way it is moving forward is still something we could work with. But I was, to be honest, skeptical about all this idea of sharing power with China over Pacific and power sharing with China, and we could work together, it's wide enough. So Japan was kind of, I don't say sideline, there was alliance and, trust, 70 years. I didn't have any worry about it, but my worry was that the approach of the United States to China. Now, over the years, there was a shift, of course. Today, my worry is the rather opposite. As John said it, kind of overreaction to the nature of Chinese rise. People are talking more about the Chinese threat and challenge. It is challenge, but at the same time, I think I'm convinced that we have to manage the relationship with China properly. I think the fundamental question is how we will do it. So all this debate yesterday, today, has convinced me that we have to find a way to coexist with China properly and strategically.
Thank you. Ambassador Singh, we're going to toss to you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Good afternoon to my fellow panelists. And thank you, Ken. Thank you, JIIA, for inviting me to join the Tokyo Dialogue for the 5th time. I'm Hemant Singh. I've been asked to address the big picture, and the question before us is, how do you rebuild international security and cooperation? So I will suggest one underlying cause and a possible remedy. It is quite clear that the US-led West has anchored the existing UN Charter-based order since 1945 and still controls virtually all the critical levers of power. However, it's also a fact that transgressions of this order have not only persisted, but have multiplied post-1991, which has been a period of the West's ascendancy. The reality is that the West's capacity to exercise unilateral power and influence is being contested in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. It is struggling to secure desired outcomes, and its narratives are not winning over the rest. And among the reasons for this fracture is that global power equations are not set in stone, and the balance is inexorably shifting from the Euro-Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific. A new global landscape, which is more multipolar, is emerging. The international community, I would suggest, is obviously much wider than the G7, NATO, and the collective West. It follows that broader convergence across an increasingly multipolar world will be difficult to achieve based on the presumption of Western dominance alone. So above all, the solution, it will require accommodation of emerging powers through meaningful reform of multilateral institutions, tasked with security, development, and cooperation, consistent with contemporary and evolving realities. And I think that this will, in my view, be in the interest of the West itself.
Thank you. Wow, we're doing really well with the succinct answers so far. Very happy. I want to go the other way around now. So Ambassador Singh, we'll start with you, but because the session is focused on next steps and concrete steps for the mid to long term, and we do want to stay focused on that. And thank you for mentioning within that framework as well. I want to ask specifically about the role of Japan in this increasingly destabilizing world. Of course, we're here in Tokyo, and each of you come from this from a different vantage point. So I'm very interested to hear each of your assessments. We've talked about much of the world in chaos, the multipolar world, lots of many conflicts happening at the same time. And these global scale problems are enormous and, deadlier and more complex conflicts. There's concerns about, potential for nuclear war. Then on top of that, there's climate change, emergence of AI. What are the feasible steps that Japan can and needs to take to help the international community move towards stability? And also, why Japan? Why should Japan be playing that role in that specific assessment that you'll be making? Ambassador Singh, we'll start with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. It is, of course, I think, for Japan to determine its own role in contributing to global stability. But I will try and offer some pointers and make some suggestions. Keeping, again, to the big picture, Japan is currently a non-permanent member of the UNSC, and it's a leading contributor to development assistance. So I think it's extremely well placed to make an impact on reviving multilateral cooperation, which has become increasingly ineffective and even dysfunctional. To begin with, Japan can take the lead in ensuring that multilateral cooperation is not only about security, but focuses meaningfully on economic progress and development, particularly of the most disadvantaged nations of the global south. Next, there is a problem here of selectivity and double standards, which is undermining global solidarity. So we can look to Japan as a power which is very strongly in favor of normative standards to rebuild trust by championing uniform and transparent adherence to the core principles of the UN Charter and international law. And these, by the way, not only include territorial integrity, sovereignty, and political independence, but also mutual and equal security. Furthermore, Japan can push for negotiated solutions to long-standing problems that have been allowed to fester based on the principles of international law, not unilateralism. The Palestine issue, for instance, has remained unresolved since 1948. Now, this is an important point. It is clear that the pursuit of war cannot make achievement of peace easier. And the horrific wars of today are difficult to win on the battlefield. Any resolution will eventually involve a balance of interests. As a pacifist nation, I think Japan needs to make its voice heard more firmly in favor of peace. Japan can also bring dialogue and diplomacy center stage. I think in a divided world, respecting various viewpoints provides the basis of cooperation. The guiding principle which Japan can lead with is to engage, not set the agenda and dictate. If there is to be greater stability and balance in the global system, the heft and role of middle powers, Japan and India among them, needs to be given room. And so finally, I think Japan, this is another important issue. To me, Japan today appears to be positioned more in support of Western primacy and victory in the European war than it is engaged in securing the future of a rising multipolar Asia. We need Japan to be an important pillar of Asian security. Finally, as a traditional believer in normative order, I think Japan has a very special role in building a wider stakeholding across the international community in support of the UN Charter-based order that delivers both security and development.
Thank you. Ambassador Sasae?
What Japan can do. I think there are three things. One is Japan's role, especially in this region, is to keep the United States engaged and play the role befitting, I would say, its values and international standing. There are lots of debates about United States could be looking inward and too much preoccupied with its own affairs and asking the other to do more. But expecting that one, I think the most important thing is, even though there could be some disputes and problem, we need to have the United States engaged. I think that's the basic things. So I think Japan need to play the role, not only to strengthen the alliance, but also to seek the alliance network with other countries in the region, and not necessarily limited to our traditional friends and allies, but even beyond that. Some neutral countries like ASEAN and others. I think in that way, we have some basic common asset to stabilize the region. Number two is that Japan could possibly do play a role, which we built over 70 years, and that is economic diplomacy and economic assistance program. And these days, we try to reverse some of the declining trend because of budget issues. I think we once again need to rebuild our official development assistance program, which is underway now, as the foreign minister talked yesterday. And one more thing is that whether you like it or not, there is more protectionism on the horizon. It's not simply because of American is looking inward. I think mood of the countries here and there are there and to protect its national interests. Some of them are legitimate, like economic security interests, but I think often the case that is used to protect your own domestic industries, going beyond the pure narrow sense of economic security. So I think one of the things Japan can do is continue to work on the regional free trade. And that includes a regional trade architecture and investment architecture, not to mention TPP, but all other regional economic architecture. United States, for example, all this IPEF is not necessarily popular. But even if it is dying in the United States, we would like to keep it alive and expand. And because of all these supply chain issues and so forth, they are the legitimate issues. So I think Japan could do that. Number three is that international security role. I think there is a debate now, what can we do more? But that will require some of the reviews of the existing and traditional, I don't say barrier, restrictions we impose ourselves that include the export of arms. When I see all the European friends and American friends are trying to support Ukraine militarily, we have to limit ourselves. And I believe that we could do the same things in line with our friends and allies. So that this is not, the issues of constitution. This is not issues of, I would say, some violations. I think it's more an issue of mindset of the government and people. So I think there is a long way to go, but I think there is some effort underway to increase our own defense. So increase our own defense would mean that we could increase our own deterrence against the North Korean threat and emerging Chinese challenge and even Russian challenge, not necessarily limited to Europe, but in this part of the world, Russia continues to be a big problem to us. So I think that is something we can do. And finally, as a foreign minister, said yesterday, I think Japan needs to work for the human dignity and individual human security as the foundations of our nations. For that, I think we have been doing, this for long years, but I think we could boost this aspect of humanity and standing of Japan in the region.
Great, thank you. Actually, I think you touched on a lot of things that other speakers might also be able to respond to, but go ahead.
Thanks, Michelle. And I don't think there's much of a need for me to go further. I think President Sasae explained Japan's role pretty well. Just a couple of points that completely agree with the point that one of Japan's important roles is to continue to incentivize and encourage US engagement in this region. But I also flip it a bit to say that Japan has a really important role to ensure that this region doesn't only view the US as the great power involved in competition. Japan offers this region that is very suspicious of strategic competition, very scared of conflict, an alternative to the great power of the US. Anytime Japan is involved in discussions, in actions, Southeast Asia and the Pacific, they listen and they respect that. So Japan's role in not leaving everything to the United States is absolutely crucial, whether it's in trilaterals with Australia, trilaterals with Korea, the Quad. Japan's work with the G7 has been, in my view, remarkable to bring the theme of economic security together to ensure that we no longer separate economics and security. That's testament to Japan's work. Your current strategy and trajectory of defense investment security decisions is very, very strong. So I think continuing that, working with partners is vital. Two things in terms of what President Sasae and Ambassador Singh said quickly. In terms of Ambassador Singh's comment that we really all need to stand up against unilateral action, I couldn't agree more. I don't think there's a better example than Russia's unilateral action against Ukraine. So that's why, of course, Japan is in the Indo-Pacific and has a crucial role here. But I think the role that Japan is playing in showing why we in the Indo-Pacific need to care about the outcome in Ukraine is exactly right, is very, very important. Both John and President Sasae talk about not overplaying, over-exaggerating the threat from Beijing. I think that's important, but there's no need to poke unnecessarily or to use extremist language, and that doesn't help. But I do think that it's hard to overplay the number of international breaches that China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are undertaking at the moment. And I think it is Japan's role, along with Australia and its partners, that every time there is a breach of international law, we call it out. We can't afford to pick and choose, to say we mentioned it last week, the same actions happened this week, so we won't mention it because we mentioned it last week. That inconsistency hurts us, whether it's law of the sea, cyberspace, space itself. We've got to hold countries to account, no matter their economic might and no matter our relationships with them. So when there's aggression against the Philippines in the South China Sea, we've got to call it out. When there is aggression against Taiwan, we've got to call it out. When there's foreign interference, we've got to call it out. So I think there's a distinction between overplaying something and using extremist language, but just by acting consistently with the rules that protect us.
Great. Dr. Hamre, can you also respond to the points made here about keeping U.S. engaged, but also not leaving everything to the U.S., and the point that Ambassador Sasae made about TPP and IPEF?
Well, you can infer answers to those questions from what I'm going to say. Japan hosted the Osaka G20 summit. This was now, I think, 5 years ago, and it recently hosted the Hiroshima G7 summit, and I thought they did a brilliant job in both of those. I thought the Gaima show did a brilliant job. It was an elegant but constructive formulation of global values that reinforced the importance of democracy and freedom and economic opportunity in a way that was compelling but not offensive to China. And that is not something we could do. Because of our domestic politics, both parties are competing who can be most anti-China. So we're going to come up with a narrative that's going to be awkward for other Asians to associate with. We're going to be too aggressive, and a lot of people in Asia are going to say, yeah, I don't want to get close to that. you know? But Japan formulated, I thought in a brilliant way, everything that we care about, but they did it in a way that was not offensive. So I think Japan is already playing a very vital role in this regard. I'm not of the view that Japan is deficient and needs to do more. I think Japan on its own has decided it has to have a stronger military, and I think that's a very good decision. But Japan's diplomacy has been stunning these last 5 years. And it has been very constructive for American interests in the Pacific. So there's an awful lot good here.
And I, of course, find, unfortunately, very little to disagree with in what's been said. So just add or perhaps I'll reinforce a couple of points. I mean, no question that we see emerging a more confident, stronger Japan in terms of defense and security policy. That is a critical stabilizing factor in East Asia, be that Korean Peninsula, or be that Taiwan, or be that the different China Sea disputes. So that is a good thing, and that without too many trumpets should be discreetly, of course, encouraged. Another issue which was mentioned, which I think is important for Japan, is of course the trading issues. I mean, Japan has its own interest in that. We Europeans have an interest in the trading issues. The Americans have given up anything that could be even resemble trade policy. And one of the disadvantages with this is that it risks leaving the field open to the Chinese. There are now, I think, 130 countries around the world that has China as the #1 trading partner. There are 20 countries that have United States as #1 trading partners. They're all from Colombia to Canada and all of the islands in between, but no country whatsoever further away than that. So we have an interest in an open trading global regime. That's a European, that's a Japanese interest. And that is important in this China context, but it's also important in the context of the developing world, the SDGs. You can't achieve the SDGs if we have this trend towards increasing protectionism reinforcing itself further. And I think that should be recognized. Final point just on China, following what John said, is this peak China or not? Who knows? My only slightly philosophical reflection on that is that if you look at the trajectory of the domestic politics of China during the last, say, half century, it hasn't been exactly linear. There have been significant shifts in Chinese politics, and we don't know what's happening in the Zhongnanhai or the closed circles or the disputes that are going on. But I don't think we can say automatically what's going to be China 10 or 15 years down the line. It could be a more repressive, more inward-looking, perhaps even more assertive, perhaps even aggressive China. But it could also be China that learns the lesson of what they have been doing in terms of mistakes the past few years, opens up somewhat. And in that particular case, I mean, look at Taiwan, look at South Korea. The potential economic one, if you pursue somewhat more liberalizing economic policies, is phenomenal. And then we will be faced with a China challenge of a quite other sort, but also quite other magnitude.
Thank you for that. I want to briefly return to the issue of partnerships, because that's been mentioned several times now. And we are talking about next steps, mid to long-term steps and solutions. And of course, one of the major themes that's been discussed here has been the U.S.-China competition, the political and security situation in the Indo-Pacific region. We've seen new groupings and efforts in the region to bolster ties with this regard, not just the Quad, but also U.S.-Japan-Philippines trilateral, Japan strengthening ties with ASEAN. That comes on top of, strengthened relationships now with U.S., Japan, South Korea. I want to ask ask Mr. Bassi, Ambassador Singh, and Dr. Hamre, how do you see these? How do you assess these evolving and expanding bilateral and minilateral security cooperation and defense relations throughout this region? And what is the role of these partnerships moving forward? Start with Mr. Bassi.
Thanks, Michelle. I think, in short, the answer is they're crucial, and for a few reasons. One being is, unfortunately, the UN, when you have one of the permanent five invading another country, it shows that the system is not effective, and attempts at reforming the UN are going to be ineffectual for some time. I think, as we've discussed at this conference, there are several great UN-related bodies, of course, doing wonderful work, probably because we're not interfering with them and just letting them be behind the scenes. But for now, UN reform looks at least temporarily hopeless. The G20, for similar reasons, is not being effective. So it means that there has to have been a choice made, and the choice is for, largely, in my view, liberal democracies to come together and be proud of our values and principles. I am concerned that over the past decade or so, the word values, or the belief in values, has become a bit of an embarrassment and a dirty word. We are too focused on interests, which tend to mean financial interests. We need the liberal democracies to advocate for the principles and values that have kept us safe since World War II. And that's why the minilaterals that you refer to, I mentioned a couple of them earlier, whether they be the trilateral that Australia has with Japan and the US, the trilateral that the US and Japan have with Korea, a fabulous Camp David meeting recently, the Quad, of course, AUKUS. These groupings need to be effective in the next stage. So the Quad is now baked into the four countries, but we need the Quad to be more than just meeting annually. We need it to be effective, which means, in my view, it needs to have an element of security and defence. We can't afford the Quad to simply be about economic prosperity, notwithstanding how important that is. Has to be, as I think previous people have said, have a security context. And we need these regional bodies, the trilaterals, the Quad, to work with other established institutions. ASEAN. There is a major ASEAN summit in Melbourne, Australia next week. I hope that the Quad at least gets a reference in that ASEAN summit. And we need the Quad and the trilaterals working with the EU and with NATO. We need these institutions and these minilateral groupings that require set frameworks to work together. And I think that's in both the interests of those parties, those nations that are part of the groups, but also the countries around us. So it's absolutely imperative that we continue to show that the Quad is not just the four countries getting together and being anti-China. It's the four countries coming together for the security and stability of the region, just as it is with the trilateral, trilaterals that I mentioned.
Dr. Hamre?
If NATO is a strong alliance, but it's strong in only one direction. If you use the analogy of a fabric, it's very resistant to pressure in one direction, resisting Russia. But it's not a strong fabric when it comes to other security problems. It's woven in only one way. It's woven against Russia. But what we're doing in Asia is very different. We're weaving a fabric here that has strands from countless different directions, and it's going to be strong in almost every direction because it's not trying to be a monolithic alliance in only one dimension. And we're putting together these different networks, and it's very important for Australia to build its networks. It's very important for Japan to build its networks. For it not to be an American-led thing, it's going to be a much stronger fabric. This is going to be the much more resilient security structure over time. So I'm very optimistic about where we're heading on all of this. I think it makes sense. And it's going to result in a much stronger fabric of deterrence and security in Asia.
Thank you. Ambassador Singh.
Thank you, Michelle. Let me give a little bit of a context to the Indo-Pacific, and then say a little bit about China, and then finally about the Quad. First of all, I think it's pretty widely recognized today that no region of the world will have a greater impact on the future of world order than the Indo-Pacific. And I must say, however, that this is not really yet reflected in the key institutions of global decision-making, where Asia is underrepresented. I'd like to add that it is important to remember that the Indo-Pacific is not the Asia-Pacific. It includes the entire interconnected oceanic space from East Asia to the Indian Ocean. Without India, there is no Indo-Pacific. And the approach towards the Indo-Pacific, therefore, needs to be more holistic. Okay, now about China, I mean, this ongoing US-China standoff is not new. It's been coming for the last decade or more. After China's rise was consciously enabled by the West, China never entered the tent of the US-led rules-based order as a responsible stakeholder. And its desire to dominate Asia is quite evident. And the second issue related to China is that its expansionist designs in the East China Sea or the South China Sea have met with mild resistance, if I can call it that. India's resistance and resolute pushback against China's military aggression in the Himalayas is, on the other hand, a rather robust pushback. China, as a result, does not see itself bound by any restrictions of normative order under international law, and believes it can exercise military and economic coercion at will to impose its hegemony. ASEAN, we talk about ASEAN, but I think ASEAN is so economically dependent on China that it's unable to offer a collective response against China's unilateral assertions. And this will continue to be the case. ASEAN will continue with its balancing act. Meanwhile, China's advances in the South China Sea are enabling the westward expansion of its power into the Indian Ocean, which is a critical artery of international trade and energy flows. Tensions in the Indian Ocean on its western periphery are also rising as new power alignments take place, and China is very much a part of those new alignments. Given this scenario, here's the thing about the Quad. Indo-Pacific security balancing is falling behind and remains fragmented. The aggregated power of the US and its allies is locked in a standoff with China in East Asia. The Indian Navy largely remains the only major security presence in the Indian Ocean. I think it is time for the Quad to step up as a factor of reassurance with greater bandwidth for the Indian Ocean. And here I entirely agree with the remarks in this regard made by Justin. We would certainly like to see a much more sustained and effective role being played by the US and Japan in the Indian Ocean. Stop there.
Great, thank you. Okay, so before we get to questions, I want to get to the topic that Dr. Hamre started off with early at the beginning, which is the one person who could come back to office, Donald J. Trump. So the former President Trump is likely to be the GOP nominee, and there is a feasible path to victory for him in November. And I understand that Moshe Torah has been discussed several times today and yesterday. What if he comes back? I want to ask each of you, and we only have 15 minutes before questions. So that's a hint. So I want to ask each of you about what are lessons that your countries learned from the first time around of President Trump, and how do you think that will inform a potential second term moving forward under U.S. leadership of Donald Trump? And Mr. Bildt, I'll start with you, especially given that it's a big week for Sweden and NATO, and President Trump has made some fresh comments about NATO. So I'm curious first about your response to that and your response to the question.
Well, the experience of the Trump 1 administration from the European perspective is, of course, that we survived, but barely. It was a rough ride, mildly speaking. And you can read the different books that have been published, John Bolton and others, and you can get the inside story of the rather tumultuous experience, tumultuous and irrational to a certain extent, experience that it was during those particular years. There are for some areas of particular concern. One of them that has been, of course, much graver since then is Russia. And it's fairly obvious that he has particular feelings for some reason or the other for Russia, and reverse feelings for Ukraine. And of course, this leads to severe worries about the consequences for European security. He dislikes NATO, he dislikes the European Union even more, and he is profoundly uninterested in trade. And add to that issues like climate policy doesn't figure on his agenda whatsoever, except that he's against it. So you can see quite an agenda building up where if he comes back, there will be issues of concern, if I phrase myself as diplomatic as I can, and issues of major tension across the Atlantic. On the global side, I'm particularly worried about the trade issues. He's going to have a big tariff on everything. And we are not, the global economy is not too bad, but it's not too good either. We have lower growth figures of both trade and growth that we have in the last few decades. And if you have major trade turmoil on top of that, it is not going to be a good thing. So I am, as you might understand, slightly skeptical.
Thank you. How about we go to, we skip Dr. Hemant, we'll come to you last for the American point of view. Mr. Bassi, go ahead.
I look forward to that. It's a good question, as you say. It's a question that's been on everyone's minds, and each panel has been asked. From the Australian side, I was in the Australian Prime Minister's office as Prime Minister Turnbull's National Security Advisor when President Trump came into office for his first term. And it was a pretty testy first phone call. People can find that online. It was leaked. But after that testy phone call, in my view, Australia managed the first Trump administration as well as most nations. Arguably, Japan, India, the Quad partners were most effective. I agree with Carl that in terms of the Indo-Pacific countries and the Quad in particular managed the Trump administration and had far more success and effectiveness than Europe. So I understand the concerns that Europe has. We all should. But I think, as you pointed out in your question, we've got to actually look back and learn from the first Trump administration. And there will be things that he says, things that he tweets, and some decisions that we don't like, or that we don't agree with. My view is that we've got to stay true to our principles and values, and not treat President Trump differently to any other person. If there's something we disagree with, our political leaders have to say it. Again, they don't have to poke the president in the face, in the eyes. Just have to disagree with it as an action, as a decision. And an example being the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, when President Trump withdrew from the TPP negotiations, which was a bipartisan view in the US. Australia and Japan, and in my view, former PM Abe, along with Prime Minister Turnbull and others, made a concerted decision not to say, well, President Trump has made a terrible decision and therefore the world's blown up. We firmly believed that the Trans-Pacific Partnership was in our interests, was in the region's interests, and we continued. And we were able to say we simply disagreed with that decision. And we still disagree with that decision. So I think that's important. I would also say that for people who had the opportunity to listen to Alex Gray earlier in the conference, he was a part of the Trump's first Trump administration. If people like Alex Gray return, then in my view, there are opportunities and there are people in the administration. I think John has mentioned it, others have mentioned it. The power of liberal democracies is not simply in the person who leads that country, it's in the strength and robustness of the institutions. And countries like Australia, Japan, others need to work with those institutions and people around. We're not naive, there'll be challenges. Australia itself will need to focus in on how to ensure that we advance arrangements like AUKUS. We need to ensure that bipartisan China policies that are in the region's interests continue. And as we've spoken about, we need to collectively, Australia with others, need to collectively work with our European friends in explaining to President Trump and his people why continuing to support Ukraine and defeating Russia is in everybody's interests, including the United States.
Great, thank you. If I recall correctly, it might have been the Post that published that transcript, but anyway.
Yes, that's correct.
Ambassador.
What is our attitude to President Trump if he's elected? I think possibly the most serious concern to us means collectively is transatlantic relationship. Because I think his attitude on Russia is a little bit difficult to understand. And also his remarks about recent remarks and others cast some doubt about the sort of fundamental principle and values and so forth. So some people say that he says it, not necessarily sometimes believing it, but no. So when it comes to Indo-Pacific, as was discussed in earlier sessions, I think all this consistency of the policy from Trump to Biden, and again, if Trump will be coming back, all this free and open Indo-Pacific concept is already established and ingrained in the region. I don't think that Mr. Trump will come and say, forget about it, possibly. It is too much rooted in this region, and there is no reason for him to reject the idea. So I'm kind of optimistic on that value and notional point when it comes to in the Pacific region. But having said it, of course, there is a concern part, because I think, especially when it comes to the relationship with China and also North Korea, in other session, our Korean friend was talking about his own four points concern. I think that could be legitimate. And on our part, say, for example, in the first, initial administration, he was saying that when the United States is working hard to defend Japan, Japanese people were, drinking tea in the living room and so forth. That's rhetoric of the thought, and we really don't have to take those seriously. When it comes to actual debate and policy making, with the American responsible establishment, I would say. I think I'm still reasonably optimistic about the possibility that we could work together still. And so my thinking is that we should be properly concerned, but not really over concerned about his presidency, to the extent that we know how to deal with him tactically without losing overall strategic perspective.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes before questions. Ambassador Singh, and then we'll go to Dr. Hamre and turn to questions.
Okay, thank you. Quickly, firstly about elections this year, let me just say that the Indian general election is just about a couple of months away. It'll be the largest democratic exercise on this planet, and its results will certainly have an important bearing on world order, security, and cooperation. Now, turning to the US and the policy issues which we are discussing in this session, I think, frankly, it's rather presumptive to talk about drastic shifts in the priorities of US foreign policy under a different leader, because all democratic countries have their domestic politics to consider and their own problems to address before defining their external outlook. We need to maintain a distinction between the rhetoric and pressures of a democratic election campaign and the subsequent exercise of presidential power and decision making. And in that regard, I think I connect well with what Ken just said. A case in point, I think, is the continuity of several policies over the last two administrations. And these certainly include US-India relations. Now, coming to how the US may change about its allies, etc. My view is that the US alliances remain the mainstay of its power. And looking ahead, the US will continue to exercise its deterrent power and influence. It will continue to support its allies and partners, including in the Indo-Pacific. But with US power under pressure from multiple crises, allies and partners will certainly be required to assume greater responsibility. And there will be no room for free riding. Now, coming to India and the US, I think, of course, we will respect the outcome of any outcome of the US presidential election and work closely with the incumbent US administration. However, we look at the US in relation to its policies towards India, and how these impact India's interests. But that said, there is considerable trust, I think, maturity, stability in the India-US partnership today. There is also a lot of broad bipartisan support for the continued strengthening of these relations. So we are fairly confident that the US-India relationship will continue to progress in times ahead, and not least because of the long-term impact it will have on the stability of the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you. What do you think?
Well, let's go back to the Trump administration, whether it's the first one or the last one, I don't know. When President Trump threatened to pull troops out of Korea unless the Koreans quintupled their host nation support, the Congress quietly passed legislation to prevent the president from removing troops from Korea without congressional approval. When President Trump threatened Japan, about pulling troops out, Congress passed legislation that's called the Asia Reassurance Initiative, which was funding infrastructure to deepen our support in Asia. When President Trump said some crazy things about Putin, was it Stockholm or Helsinki, I guess it was, Congress passed legislation to impose much stronger sanctions on Russia. When President Trump and his surrogates challenged the legitimacy of the election, judges all over America stood up against that pressure and insisted on evidence, not just arguments. So my point is, there's depth and strength in our federal system and in our checks and balances in our government. That'll be there. So don't be panicked here. You know, almost every politician, there are a few wacko birds or some wingnuts, but most every politician really believes very strongly in the oath of office that they take. And we'll get through this, don't worry.
It's a great place to turn to questions, I think. Yes, right up here.
Thank you very much. My name is Masunaga, Scholar of International Relations and Political Science, and I have one quick question to Mr. Bassi about the diplomacy of Australia. I'm quite interested in your relationship between Canada, which is important middle power in this region, and of course, needless to say, you have a much common background and common interests. So I know the existence of Five Eyes, but could you tell us a bit more about the relationship between Canada and Australia? Thank you.
Sure, and thank you for raising it, because it was remiss of me when Michelle asked the question about minilaterals. I focused on the newer ones. The Five Eyes is clearly of extreme importance, and both from an intelligence sharing perspective, but in my view, it's far beyond intelligence sharing, and from all things foreign policy, security, defense policy. The Five Eyes is important. I think similar to the Quad, I think the Five Eyes' greatest challenge is to ensure that we don't just utter the word, but we actually show that there's substance behind it. And I do think the last few years, the Five Eyes has receded to being a very heavily dominated officials grouping, which is important, and information sharing amongst officials is vitally important. But I think for Five Eyes to be most effective, it needs to be advocated, promoted at the ministerial level. And I think we've lacked that a little. I think before quickly getting to Canada, I think the relatively new New Zealand government is showing early signs that it wants to re-engage in the Five Eyes network, and that's a very positive thing. In terms of Australia, Canada, obviously apart from the Five Eyes, Australia and Canada, one of the bilateral relationships' greatest challenges is the fact that we don't really have any problems. And in the world that the JIIA report entitles A World in Turmoil, Australia, Canada, many countries are so busy countering the threats and challenges and bilateral irritants. There is a risk, and Australia falls into this category. And don't just see it with Canada, but Canada is an example where largely Australia and Canada share principles and values, and we don't really have significant bilateral irritants. Where I think we should be, where Australia, apart from focusing in on the bilateral relationship because it's important, and two liberal democracies, and we have very important roles to play in the world, and we both, of course, have strong relationships with countries like the US. Where I think, and I know time, so very quickly, where I think Australia can play an important role is that Australia is a member of the Quad with India, a member of the Five Eyes with Canada, and of course at the moment there is a tension between Canada and India, I think it is in Australia's interests. I think it's in the world's interests. It's in democratic interests that Canada and India resolve those issues. And Australia, as a very close friend and partner to them both, can play that type of role. Thanks.
Any other questions? Come on, final session. Yes, go ahead.
Director Sasae at the beginning mentioned that we have to seek coexistence with China. I think, well, that is important for the peace and security in this region. But in the meantime, we see the people in Uyghur, for example, are very much oppressed. Also, people in Tibet. And more recently, the people in Hong Kong were terribly oppressed, and they're deprived of their freedom of expression and political freedom. So should we be closing our eyes on those questions for the sake of coexistence, or what should we be doing?
My answer is that we should deal with two different set of issues simultaneously. When I say coexist, mean that we can't completely contain China or decouple China or alienate China, because China is already part of international system for over years, including economic, kind of interdependence. And I think this one applies not only to Japan, but throughout the region and beyond the region, including the United States. So, and that's what I'm saying, we need to coexist. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that we would neglect about the Chinese human rights issues and Tibet and all the suppressions of freedom of press and so forth. We continue to address that question, but in every country around the world, there are not so many completely democratic countries. I mean, there is a difference. In some countries, strategic interest is on top of human rights. Of course, a country like, North Korea, say, we are worried about threat from North Korea. But can you say it that we could neglect humanitarian issues like abduction and so forth? So I think we need to be properly addressing both of a concern, and it's not a trade-off.
Any final questions? Everyone's tired? Well, I do have a final question for Ambassador Sasae and Dr. Hamre, actually, because there's the Prime Minister Kishida's state visit coming up in the US and Washington. He's heading over there in April. What are you looking for from this trip? What do you hope will be addressed?
Yeah, I'm not talking with the Prime Minister on what he's going to do in Washington, but I'm sure that there is the confirmations of the strong alliance developing in the region and beyond the region. They would address all these global issues we have discussed yesterday and today, naturally. But I think the important thing is possibly to make sure that we will continue to develop our alliance, defense alliance especially. I think John Hamre earlier sessions talked about the importance of adjustment of a command and control structure. I think I don't know whether that will be fully addressed, but also that is a part of, I would say, overall agenda to government need to address in the coming, months and even year. So I think there are many agendas they have to address, and I think I'm sure that they would even try on the global agenda, including environment, energy, and as far as they could go. But I think the important thing is to continue to be how we would address the impending challenges, all the three fronts. I'm not quite sure they would discuss about American issues, but I'm sure that Prime Minister would hope that America will be united to confront with these difficult issues.
Dr. Hamre?
Well, there's so much that we agree on, so that I think this is going to be a summit that there'll be just very strong resonance, I think, of affirming where each other stands on so many issues. There are a couple of issues. I think that Japan wasn't as unhappy as Korea was about the semiconductor restrictions, but I think Japan will raise the question, how are you going to consult with us, about technology issues? I think that's, and I know that Japan is taking very seriously the question of technology security matters, but they want to have a framework for it, not just America doing it and then everybody else having to agree. So I think that'll probably be a topic of conversation. I hope that they will talk about strengthening the command relationship between Japan and the United States. Japan's made a profound change in its defense planning. It's going to create a joint combat operations command. But that means we need to change on our side how we work with Japan. I mean, we have U.S. Forces Japan here in Japan, but it is a very weak administrative organization. It's not a warfighting organization. It's not like U.S. Forces Korea. So that should be on the agenda. I hope that President Kishida raises that. Because there does need to be a change in that regard. And then I think that President Biden should say to Japan, you all need to get a more integrated approach to your intelligence community. You got a lot of stovepipe activities. You don't integrate it well enough. We need to see that on your side, because that would help us work more closely with you. So I think there's some issues like that.
Well, thank you all so much. We're right at time. I want to thank all the panelists and to the Japan Institute of International Affairs. And thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
For discussion.